Welcome to another video by your friend Matthew Sherling. It's been a long time since I did a this versus this video. In the past I did infinity versus, the infinite versus the finite, for example. What else did I do? Soul versus spirit. All sorts of stuff like that, right? Now, believe it or not, I am interested in the practical. These videos often get a little abstract and maybe esoteric, and I apologize if that turns you off. But some regions of my being are drawn to these sorts of nerdy, abstract, and spiritual issues. So I wanted to talk today about emptiness versus the absolute. So emptiness, when it comes to spirituality, most often appears in Buddhism, and emptiness is a central part of Buddhism. In Buddhism, one way that it is expressed is that every single thing is empty of a separate or unchanging self. That's why Buddhism reacted so strongly against the Hindu idea of the Atman, because the Atman is kind of it is unchanging and absolute and perhaps unconditioned. And in Buddhism, there's a strong reaction against that idea of any sort of fixed, stable, unchanging essence. In the same way that something like process philosophy reacts strongly against the traditional philosophical idea of there being some substance. So process philosophy that kind of emerged in the early 20th century, but definitely had predecessors before that, all the way back to Heraclitus in ancient Greece. You could say Heraclitus was a process philosopher. Definitely Henri Bergson is a process philosopher in the early 1900s as well. And then Alfred North Whitehead is usually referenced the most when people talk about process philosophy, but I'll make another video about that. There are striking parallels between those two things. But so something that's often on my mind about these big questions, is like, is everything evolving and in process, or are there elements, or is there an element of reality that is unchanging and not in process somehow? I'm still wrestling with that, I know it sounds, I would imagine that most people don't even consider that question, and it means it might not mean anything to a lot of people. That's fine. It's something that comes up for me when I think about these things, when I read about these things, when I explore reality through experience, practice, research, curiosity, history. So I wanted to talk about emptiness versus the absolute. So, in Buddhism, in some ways, you could say that emptiness is kind of equivalent with absolute reality. Now, I think I made a video about the absolute versus the relative. If I didn't, then I should have. And I also made a video about emptiness and interdependence. So I've talked about these things before, but let's think. I'm talking on the fly here, which is one thing I love about making these more free-form videos, But let's think about this. Okay, so in Buddhism, emptiness, you could say, is equivalent to the absolute. Because in Buddhism, there's the absolute and the relative, in a lot of streams of Buddhism, especially in Mahayana Buddhism. And the relative is the changing, the impermanent, the socially constructed, the ego, the things attached to the ego, blah, blah, blah. And, the world of time and the world of our names and social identities and stuff. That's the relative. And, in Mahayana Buddhism, Nagarjuna really articulated how the absolute and the relative are fused as one. So ultimately, there isn't a pure dichotomy or dualism between these things. But when we use language, it's kind of natural and maybe useful to talk about them as if they are in a binary relationship or something, right? But emptiness is, as I said, the fact that no one thing is empty of a separate, unchanging self, because every single thing is in an interdependent relationship with everything else. Or, more specifically, this pen is, it doesn't just exist by itself. It exists because of all the multiple factors that allow it to exist as it is, all the people that made it, all of the conditions that allowed it to take place, all of the technological developments that allow a pen like this to exist, blah, blah, blah. There's tons and tons of factors that allow this pen to exist, and therefore it is an interdependent phenomenon, just like I am, just like you are, just like every single thing is. The sun, the planet, my balcony, the moon, my headphones, my jacket, this. So, everything is empty of that separate self. Yeah, I feel that. Cool. Another way to look at emptiness is that it is empty of the concept. Reality itself, you could say, at least from one angle, is empty of the concepts that we throw on top of it. So, if my back hurts, if my back hurts, I can have all sorts of concepts and reactions about that and say, oh my God, that's horrible. And, or I can not think about it and I can just be with the back pain. If I see somebody in public, I can judge them or be neutral about them or be attracted to them or repulsed by them and it's easy to kind of categorize people's behaviors, but we don't have to. We can just be with that person instead of jumping to ideas about them. So that's another way to look at emptiness, is that reality is empty of all of the ideas that we throw on top of it. And of course, reality does also consist of our ideas. And maybe that's where it leads to the absolute. That's a good bridge to the absolute. Because in Buddhism, since emptiness is kind of equivalent to the absolute, in my own, the way that I've conditioned my thinking for the last 15 years or so, I kind of often would see the absolute and emptiness as the same thing, right? But I don't think that's true. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the old yantra in Hinduism, especially in Tantra. There are things called yantras, which are kind of like mandalas, and the most famous yantra is called the Shri yantra, and it's a ton of triangles, some pointing downward and some pointing upward, and within this kind of circle, and the circle is within this kind of like more rectangular, or a series of rectangles. You should look it up if you haven't seen it. Just type in Shri Yantra. It's a beautiful image. I love it. And I'll talk more about what yantras are at some other point. But I bring that up to say that in the Shri Yantra, in the middle, there's the circle. Most mandalas and most yantras have this circle, this small circle in the middle, and that small circle is called a bindu, and usually that bindu is known as, you could say, the absolute, or you could say emptiness, the fertile void. And so when I look at the Sri Yantra now, instead of seeing that bindu in the middle as the absolute, it is emptiness, That bindu is emptiness. It's like the center point of emptiness, with all of the manifested forms surrounding it, or emerging from it, or emanating from it. But I would say that, just using that as an analogy, the image of the Sri Yantra, it's not that the bindu in the center is the absolute, it's that the whole thing is the absolute. I would say that the absolute means reality in its totality. Reality in its totality. To me, that makes sense to say that is the absolute. So the absolute contains the relative and emptiness and form and energy and matter and mind and everything, literally everything. The absolute is the totality of everything. And so, in that way, the absolute transcends emptiness, because you could say that emptiness is the unmanifest. Emptiness is infinite potential, because emptiness is no one thing. It's no thing. It's nothing. But that nothing, that no thing, that unmanifest, is the reason that anything can manifest. Because in the manifest world, in the world of forms, in the world of change, in the world of temporal existence, the world of impermanence, the world of flux and process, that process is facilitated by emptiness. The forms go away. The forms do not stay. Novelty always emerges, no matter what, because no moment is identical. And so emptiness is one component of the absolute. Emptiness is form, form is emptiness. Emptiness is no other than form, form is no other than emptiness. That's what the Heart Sutra says. And, I know this has been a spontaneous freestyle here. I hope some of it made sense at least. I could say a lot more about it and compare emptiness to this, that, and the other. But I think that I'm going to land there for now. Please leave comments if you have any thoughts about this, any feelings, any questions, disagreements. I welcome all of that. And until next time, peace.